So I said about, in my book, I wanted to really think about how initial training or teacher education, which is where I live and where I spend a great deal of my life, and something that I'm passionate about. I've had the great fortune to teach over 10 years, a lot of people I can see watching now. And that's led me to think a lot about what teacher education is and what it can be. So when I started to consider the ways that pre-service teachers might engage with and understand the importance of explicitly teaching for and about empathy, I started going to my disciplines. And my background is as an English and a drama teacher. No pause for surprise there. But I was informed by and drew on some traditions that I'd been working in. I'd had the great fortune to work with a panel convened by the then Human Rights Commissioner, Gillian Triggs. And when she was steering the Human Rights Commission, we were in the absolute grip of some really ugly behaviours. And they had an effect in classrooms, of course. And I'm referring, of course, to the Adam Goodes slandering an incident. So in thinking about that, I drew together on my teachers, on my pre-service teachers, on my Indigenous and Aboriginal friends, my friend and colleague Zoe, who's graced me with her beautiful acknowledgement today, with playwrights, Thomas DeAngelis among them, Stephen Sewell and others, and disability advocates and people who could actually think about ways we might bring together those threads of inquiry. And I wanted this to really propel our conversation further. One of the interesting perspectives about empathy is that it appears and is articulated often in the history discipline. And I've spent some time with my close colleague, Kate Smythe, working in the field of history, in the discipline of history, and looking at ways that empathy is actually magnified through use of theatrical traditions like process drama. And it was by catalysing those particular affordances of traditions and theatre in a way to activate complex ideas in a very safe space, where we began to see a really resultant increase in empathy. And they're exemplified by some case studies I'd like to refer to. But back to Jacinda. You didn't think I'd leave her alone. So in thinking more about empathy and what it looked like as a lived experience, I went to some more writing that she had done for the Nelson Mandela Foundation in a little novella, well, not a novella, a little tiny piece of work called I Know This to Be True. And she recounts in the beginning a story of a little boy, little Muslim boy who came over to her when she was at the mosque consoling people. And he came to her and he met her eye and she bent down to speak with him. And he said to her, Jacinda, will I be safe now? And she said, I don't know. And one of the key pieces in really understanding an empathic pedagogy or empathy as a habit of practice is to not always have the readiness of an answer. And she says this at the end of her piece. She says, children hear us and them. Women hear us and them. People of faith hear us and them. Our rainbow communities hear us and them. And so now it's our turn to stop and to listen. So, the educational landscape. What does that look like? And where's, whether the place for empathy in this conversation? So pre-service students and my teachers that I work with on a daily and weekly basis are comprised of many different culturally disparate and different diverse language backgrounds, and their classrooms are similarly comprised. My teachers I work with in regional Australia, and I can see some of them tuning in, they have the vexing issue oftentimes of being in quite monocultural classrooms where they're looking for ways to extend understanding, perspective, etc. So these teachers are tasked with meeting the diverse needs of these, multiple students. Zambailis's work, which I really like, he talks about strategic empathy, using empathy in a planned and strategic way in creating both a physical space and a metaphorical space to test what he describes as troubled knowledge. Classrooms and drama particularly, and we know this, the research is unequivocal about drama spaces allowing students that space to test truths and to test complex ideas and troubled knowledge. Troubled knowledge, like the little Muslim boy who came to Jacinda and asked her, "Am I safe now?" Providing space, both literal and physical, for pre-service teachers to navigate and test the way they might structure learning is a big piece in empathy, as far as I have been finding. So, I'd like to talk a little bit about how in meeting those knotty challenges and delivering a really authentic and nuanced pedagogy, teachers rely on social and emotional inherencies. These can be either learnt or their dispositions. It doesn't actually really matter how we come to them, but those skills of human engagement that teachers, it's assumed, are actually riven with, are often unreliably acquired. And it's important that we need to develop habits of empathy that we can ensure allows our students an equitable access to affective ways of learning. So in the Empathic Civilization, which is a book written by a sociologist, Rivkin, in 2009, he situates empathy between the anthropological and the psychological. And he talks a lot about empathy as it relates to the environment and environmental concerns. He says that we are currently in the age of empathy. And for those of us that look around at the moment, we might actually feel that that's quite contested. The book is, I guess, 11 years old. But I think what's interesting is he challenges us to think about empathic intelligences in order to understand the brutality of the damage we've done to our natural environment, the discrimination and marginalisation of minority groups, and the ongoing deprivation of communities. And his work underscores the central theme in what I think is a very important document, the OECD's Future of Education and Skills 2030 discussion paper. It's freely available and we're able to give you the link. It's very interesting, an interesting document because it regards empathy and explicitly articulates it as an essential social and emotional skill that school students are going to need in order to navigate the future as we move towards, as 2030 comes into our sight. Rivkin's work and the position paper both grapple with the paradox that although we're seeking to develop these affective responses for the future, we're simultaneously denuding our environment. It's had a small break during the pandemic, and that's been wonderful to see. But he's also talks about the fact that global empathy is a view of humanity where there's an inter and interdisciplinary perspective that combines a neuroscientific and psychological view of the world and a way to understand the human narrative and social tapestry. And that is our classrooms every day, everywhere. I have a friend who's watching out there in cyberspace, who is head of a creative arts department at a school in the southwest. She turned up to school every day during the pandemic, during the height of the pandemic, to ensure that her students were able to access their breakfast program. And I want to come back to that example of our human narrative and social tapestry later. For our purposes, considering empathy in an affective sense, we have to think about it as part of an embodied pedagogy. Empathy we frequently see in the literature, but usually as it relates to social workers or nurses or medical students, but rarely with respect to educators and their pedagogies. But not all conceptualizations of empathy are either useful or appropriate. So popular conceptions of empathy can bring us to what is a cozy view, and as Rivkin's described, as a sugary kind of way of looking at the world. Oh, I empathise with you. That's terrible. You have, conflating those ideas with sympathy. Understanding empathy rather as a common sense concept and broadly as a social good can be deeply problematic. A simplistic view of empathy doesn't really take us very far. It's a fuzziness, there's a fuzziness to its application with respect to professional practice, and the misuse of empathy can be potentially very problematic. In examining our pedagogies and the moral undertones that our pedagogies often have, teachers and educators can help students navigate their way through troubled knowledge. And I want to talk a little bit, because I've got to keep an eye on the time. Am I okay? Just checking with the chair. I've got 5 minutes.
No.
Oh, she's very cheeky. Neither of us would get a job at the ABC, and they're thin on the ground at the moment, as we know. So I'm going to buzz past, because I'm talking a little bit too much about that, and move to the theatrical traditions in the getting of empathy. So how did I get there? And how did this journey go from empathy through to the theatrical traditions? Well, any playwright worth their salt, Thomas DeAngelis tells me, thinks about the human condition on almost an hourly basis. They experiment in their writing with ideas about human connections, about people, and sometimes the experiments are met with success, commercial or critical success, but often their work doesn't make it off the page. As an experimental pedagogy, the way I'm thinking about empathy as using etudes and a Stanislavskian approach is a bit like writing the play that sometimes never gets off the page. When we thought about empathy and ways that we might use theatrical traditions, we remembered a story. And there's a very beautiful story in the disciplines. It's become apocryphal over time, but it serves a very illustrative purpose here. It's said that, and it's called the Truce, the Christmas Eve Truce. It's said that during World War I, and I came to this when I was working with Kate and with Peter on our work about history and empathy in the disciplines. And the story goes like this, that the Allies were on, obviously, opposite sides of their battle. And it was Christmas Eve, and a truce was called. And the truce was maintained through that night with fidelity by both sides. And the story goes that the Allies sang Stille Nacht, Silent Night, and that the Allies sang back. It's said that they stopped long enough to even play football or soccer depending on your view, soccer or football on the field, and that they even shared cigarettes. And as the sun came up the next morning and the truce was over, they began their fighting with as much increased fervour as they had before. And what that story illustrated to us when we thought about it was how very human the idea, apocryphal or otherwise, of people sharing a cigarette, playing a game, singing a song, how fundamentally empathic that act is, and yet how easily we are able to revert to the status quo. So we know that there is unequivocally a plethora of evidence about arts education in classrooms. Michael Anderson, Robin Ewing, the way arts education and arts-informed work improves student success, there's just no debate. But various governments, certainly in Australia and the United Kingdom, continue to have a fairly reductive view of the arts in education and a reductive view of curricula. I mean, I call your attention to this week. But the theatre has long provided a vehicle for exploration of the human condition. It pushes boundaries, it contests ideologies, and it turns a mirror to the audience, often to provoke a reaction of introspection, discomfiture, of passion, of compassion. And it's those affective pedagogic practices and meaning making with compassion, sympathy, and empathy as its core components that we took this particular method from. An actor has to get into the mind of a character when they're imagining themselves as a character. They need to take on the role of another person and understand what motivates them. They have to think about what their desires are, what they intend, how they act. These are all empathic or empathetic tools used in the pursuit of acting in the theatrical tradition. The ability for us to harness a pedagogy of empathy is central to a theatre maker's practice. And when we worked on our particular huddle, where we brought together practitioners and artists and theatre makers, we thought that there could be a free exchange between us and we could inform the basis of a new pedagogy based in embodied and affective empathy. Now, we weren't inventing fire. The drama community and drama education community have been doing this practically since fire was invented. But it was the tradition of modern Western theatre and its usefulness in this work that we owed a theoretical and practical debt to. We began with Stanislavski and his 1949 idea of method acting, which many of us have heard about in ordinary language. The intention in method acting is to imbue a character with a sense of the actor's self while remaining true to the integrity of the text. Important from a practice perspective is Stanislavski's attention to the physical self, the language of embodied characterization, and his prioritization of the malleability of the body, no matter the body's capacity. Susan Verducci, who's done a lot of work in this particular area, talked about moral reasoning practices using Stanislavski's technique. And she suggests that the way that actors train in this method allows them to empathise by activating doable and discussable steps. Borrowing from Noddings and from Nussbaum and the idea of pity postulation, educators can, in this case, when we're using theatrical traditions, can appropriate these techniques to develop and cultivate empathy as a productive construct. She's very careful to say that students should not be manipulated in this process, but rather she talks about Brecht's caution that you need to avoid an emotional manipulation of the audience. And in this case, our audience are us, we're students and teachers. Robin Ewing, who's listening and is my mentor and friend, a leader in the field of literacy, drama and initial teacher education, has long argued that drama-rich pedagogies are vital to the social, emotional and intellectual well-being of any society. When she talks about the critical concepts that provide a framework for teachers and students to habituate the action and activity of making a difference by heightening skills of empathic intelligence and creating empathetic leaders. She reflects on the fact that it's not sufficient for us as human beings to be empathetic or to profess to have empathy for someone or something. That passive empathy is unproductive. What we need is a productive empathy that's developed using these particular methods that theatre practitioners provide us with and that produce deeply literate empaths. So, at the heart of this particular method is knowledge building using empathy that asks better questions and that habituates noticing. Asking better questions means placing students always at the centre of good teaching practice. And I'll talk a little bit about how we might use Stanislavski's magic if to precipitate deep question asking. Miller and Saxon offer a lot of ideas. They're Canadian practitioners and researchers, and they talk about a number of ways that conversations can be enlarged in classrooms by explicitly teaching critical questioning and the way a healthy community of inquiry and engaging in empathic awareness can really deepen learning and literacy. And I'd add to that list that an additional dimension of, and a critical inherency for developing rich learning is also the principles of Oecd that are derived from method acting. So, to the stage. So, when we were working on this, and I say we because I talk about us as a village, and we were a huddle. So our huddle consisted of actors and playwrights and practitioners. So when I speak of we, that's the community and the village that work together. So Stanislavski and tradition says that we need to follow a text, and we know that Robin Ewing's work, Michael's work, that work with John Nicholas Saunders' work with a pretext or an episodic pretext is very useful in this particular case. And where we went to with text was to some interviews and some material that we had. And with your indulgence, I'd like to read you this particular piece of text to give you context and a material anchor to think about this particular method. Every student should be encouraged. In terms of me, well, I've got a vision impairment, and coming from that background and having had some really horrid teachers, I hate to say it, I think I'm more aware of what impact a teacher can have on you. Even something as simple as encouragement, just positive feedback, it's so important to kids, especially the kids who are struggling to grasp what you're teaching, or the kids who just don't have self-belief. And I guess the way I think about that stems from my own schooling, I guess. I picked art for my elective. For my very first lesson, we went out onto the oval and we were meant to draw the back of the oval. And I thought, well, this is great. All I can see are big green blobs. And I said, well, miss, what am I supposed to do? And she said to me, well, just draw what you can see. That was a pretty stupid thing to say to someone who had a vision impairment. So that made me change. And she said, I might be better at computer studies. That's not fair. Art, I should have been able to draw what I could see. So we decided to use that piece of interview to develop our Stanislavskian Oecd. We began with a free reading as a group of performers, and actors, and intuiting the text. So thinking about the text and the text integrity. Stanislavski talks about the play should be studied for its action. It should be the physical map, but an etude, conversely, inhibits some of the freedoms of improvisation because the text is the map. Any diversion means you become lost in a tangent. So far from being inhibiting for performers, devotees of the method report that a freedom that an actor is given in an etude is emotional or empathic, and it allows for a true perspective of the character's actions. This method, when it's captured as a pedagogy and praxis, is productive in teaching about affective issues. It allows the student agency and liberty to explore their own perceptions about a given circumstance or a situation. When we have a context or dialogue about anything like empathy, we need to consider the idea of, multiple art forms. When we began, we were informed deeply by the Aboriginal theory and method of Dadiri, and that draws from Ungenmer's 1988 idea of listening. And that particular informed and First Nations way of looking at the world was an embodied practice that we sought to capture and sought to intersect with our way of using the etudes. We acknowledged that there were definitional difficulties with empathy because it's largely a Western phenomenon. And we thought about how we could take that from the page and through to a performed and facilitated pedagogy. Some of us think about method acting. This is probably showing my age, but that's okay. If you're old enough to have watched Marathon Man with Dustin Hoffman, the role for which he was awarded the Oscar, and it's said that his method acting was he became a marathon runner. He ran miles and miles and miles and miles, and in his head, he experienced what it was like to be a marathon runner. Whilst many of us would like some of our students to occasionally take up marathon running, it's neither practical or practicable. And it's a bit of a hollow representation of what we really want them to think about. So an etude, in this sense, forms the central dimension of active analysis, or what Stanislavski called the magic if. It requires an embodied performance. And that embodied performance mitigates any passivity or superficial interpretation of work, because the participant needs to rely on improvisation and imagination. It's like learning a second language. If I can say a few words in a second language, I can't speak that language. That doesn't mean I can speak that language. If I start to learn that language and I can speak whole sentences, and absolutely pivotally, when I can start asking a question in that language and expect someone to listen, I'm starting the way that I might actually understand and empathise in that sense. Got the wind up. Haven't got anywhere near where I was going to tell you. Quickly to the end. I wanted to talk to you about wonderment. I wanted to talk to you about pools of silence. One of the things I will do is, for those people who are interested, I'll put a potted methodology of what we actually did, how we used etude, how we used improvisation, and some of the stimulus and where that actually took us. So maybe I'll finish, as I always do, with a story, because that's what I love. So my favourite story when I was little was the story of Peter Pan. And it's kind of paradoxic, because when I was having that story read to me, I was living in an Asian country. And this was a book about cold London. But one of the enduring themes of Peter Pan is it's a tale about the quixotic Peter and the fact that he never wanted to grow up. And I thought a lot about why he didn't want to grow up when I was little. Why wouldn't you want to grow up? When you grow up, you get to eat musk sticks for dinner, surely, and stay up as long as you want to. But of course, he didn't want to grow up because he'd lose the ability to imagine and, of course, to play. And the importance of playing in etude, in improvisation, in order to develop any sort of empathy and understanding. Play is critical in any pedagogy that aspires to develop a habit of empathy. Play and imagination were so important to Peter Pan that he refused to relinquish his imagination, and he didn't want to grow up. I wanted to talk to you a little bit more about the ideal conditions for perhaps thinking about teaching pedagogy of empathy. And they are the circumstances that require space and silence, structure, safety, and surprise. Conditions where there are opportunities for troubled knowledge to be contested, for students to think about different ideas, and to have that space where disagreement and troubled knowledge can sit. Drama and play and creative practices, etudes and improvisations allow us to legitimise imagining as a pedagogic tool. The way teachers and educators can approach knowledge acquisition and the getting of empathy. Maxine Green, who's a bit of a hero of mine, tells us that of all our cognitive capacities, imagination is the one that permits us to give credence to alternative realities. And by concretising imagination as applied practice, teachers and students can develop a confidence in their practice to be empathetic, to be leaders in discipline, with confidence and with compassion and with an ethic of care. It's been wonderful talking to you this afternoon. Thank you very much for being here. I have to stay apparently. Oh, here comes my sidekick.
Yes. Hi everyone. So now we've got some time. Thank you, Ali.
Oh, don't ask anything hard.
Yeah.
No troubled knowledge here.
You didn't use the beautiful
I didn't use my painting. We
right.
didn't. Didn't get there.
So we do have some time now for some questions, and I'm going to hand it over to the chat. So if you're not sure how to use chat on Zoom, if you go up to the little bar on your screen and in the More section, click on that and there's a chat function. First time caller.
Hello, Neil.
Neil, have you, and I'm going to...
You're going to moderate.
Moderate or facilitate.
I do have a lovely activity that we used also when we were in Vietnam with this project. It's a beautiful painting that's a really interesting way to, but it's a lesson plan. I'm happy to share that as well. That's not in my book. That's in the next one.
Yes. So if you'd like to put your...
Oh man, in Shanghai.
If you'd like to put your cameras on so we can see you, and then if anyone has a question.
Oh, there's Yasso.
Yeah. Neil, is a former student of yours, and he has, we had the joy and privilege of working with him in Vietnam last year. And Neil, welcome. You're back from Vietnam because of COVID, and you've asked, what would you say about the future of empathy?
I think that's a brilliant question, Neil, and I think we saw the future of empathy as a very lived experience when we were in Hanoi. The future of empathy is with our students. It's about us being able to sit. It's about us being able to name it, I think. It's about us to expressly understand it as a teaching and learning tool. And I think it's also the future of empathy is very much about understanding the social, the environmental, and the economic. It's about the intersection of those three critical issues that our students face. That's where I think our future is. But I think naming. There's a wonderful line. Black Lives Matter movement at the moment asks us to do the work, and I think with empathy, it's about taking personal responsibility for understanding multiple perspectives and multiple ways to be in the world.
Ali, we have a caller from India. Charu is here with us.
Hello, Charu. Welcome. It's lovely to have you.
It's amazing that you've
that you're here.
Yeah.
We were meant to be coming to India to visit you this year, but we can't.
Well, but Charu would like to know, do you think we can integrate empathy in teacher training programs?
Yes, I think we do. And I think we can do it in a very authentic way that isn't just superficial, doesn't just call... Empathy isn't role play. That's not sufficient enough. And actually, Julie Dunn's asked a question about the tensions between empathy and action, the tensions between the theory and the practice. And I guess it comes back to the idea that we have to sit with the discomfiture, and we're not very good at that. We're not very good at that in classrooms because we're hardwired to teach content and to expect response. And it's a bit like the question Jacinda Ardern was asked by the little boy, am I safe now? Now, that's not a pedagogic question. It's an affective question. It's a deep question. But the fact that we have to be able to sit with that discomfiture, I think is critical. And teaching it explicitly, teaching multiple perspectives. The oft quoted scene from To Kill a Mockingbird, where Atticus, the legal counsel, says to his son, he says to Jem, you don't know what somebody else, this is a précis, but you don't know what somebody else's situation is till you've walked a mile in their skin. Now, that's quite problematic because I can't walk a mile in your skin, Charu. I can't walk, and that's presumptuous, and in fact, it's dangerous. But what I cannot do is I can ask you questions, and I can think and sit with what you tell me. I can think about listening to what you say and noticing. And I think they're the critical skills, the habits of listening and noticing and sitting with a pedagogy of discomfort sometimes, and a pedagogy of discomfort and disagreement, I think is fundamental to the way we can all move forward.
Yes, there's some more questions. Danielle has asked how to promote empathy beyond our students to the community of parents and guardians.
Oh, that's a fantastic question. I think, Danielle, thank you for that wonderful question. I'm very passionate about communities being involved in the entire educative process, and we've I've spoken to you about my own personal community and about the great strength we can derive from that community. And it's not about homogeneity. It's not about being the same. It's not about agreement or agreeance. It's about thinking about ways that we can engage others. I can use just as an example, Zoe's here in the chat. Zoe was my student well over 10 years ago. She's my colleague. I go to her for issues of culture and learning. I have learnt far more from her than I'm sure I ever taught her, and we work together. And through her, I'm able to engage with new communities, to ask questions, and to often be, to sit with discomfiture about issues of race and perspective and belonging. So I suppose, to answer your question a little bit in a more concrete way, Danielle, I think it's probably through professional associations and through huddles and through community-based ideas that we can get those ideas out there.
There's a few people who've asked about. There's a few people who've asked about the classroom and
yes.
Some practical ideas. Would you like? You didn't have a chance to talk much about actual practices.
Would it be helpful, Robin, if I put that Bruegel activity somewhere on the Create site where people could get it? Maybe I can show.
Yeah, we can certainly put that.
You probably haven't got enough time.
We can. What we could do is ask you to do a recording of the lesson, and then we could watch that. Yeah.
Yep. Absolutely.
We've got time for a couple more questions. Yes. So there's a lot of people who've this idea of questioning and empathy, and I know that that's the idea of asking better questions is really important. Can you give us some practical ideas just off the top of your head?
So if I refer back, probably a good idea is to refer back to the piece of interview dialogue that I talked about with the woman with the experience of art, not being able to take art as a subject at school because of a visual impairment. And one of the things we tried to ask questions that took us beyond the superficial. So beyond just how the woman felt at the time, we tried to think about perspectives. We thought about the teacher. We thought about the class. We also thought about the empathy of objects, which is something Kate and I are very interested in, also in research. You know, what motivates somebody? Really thinking about, well, what are the components? If I'm a teacher and I've got a student with a disability in my classroom, I have compliance obligations, quite apart, quite separate from any of the human obligations or the empathy obligations I have to my students. I have compliance obligations. What's motivating me? Compliance, governance, legislation. Am I thinking about content? Am I thinking about really the inherencies of art, that art is for everybody? Whose conceptualization of art is it? Those sorts of questions. What could she have seen if she'd been allowed to stay? Now, she told me that she saw blobs. That's what the interview said. So what does that look like? Is that not art? And what does that learning take us to? Where does that take us to? What is it like to see differently? To see the world differently through a different lens. And the activity I will share with you at a different point, we use art as an excellent way to to use empathy in the disciplines in history and geography and maths and science. It's an excellent way to situate yourself in a different time and with a different perspective. And I guess the question I ask my students when we think about that piece of interview theatre and when we did it ourselves in our huddle is we thought about in our etude, well, what is seeing and what is really seeing? And how that actually precipitates an empathy of its own.
Thank you. Jennifer Kitchen has asked, she studies the role of play in theatre education and the spaces it can open for empathy and active citizenship. Could you say a bit about how you understand and theorise playfulness in your work?
Jennifer, I'll just go to my excellent chapter on play. I think the role of play is fundamental to the way we actually live in the world. And I think if we had time for more play in the world, we'd probably actually allow ourselves more opportunity to actually connect and coalesce. In some of the previous work that Kate and I have done in history with teachers, they have spoken to us at length about how professional learning that uses drama-rich pedagogies, that uses theatrical traditions and other methodologies, actually allows them a moment of elements of surprise. You're surprised when you're able to play in a space that allows you to think about new conceptualizations. When I use the Bruges painting and people think about how they might, who they might be in that painting, where they might have been before the painting, what's the internal dialogue that's going on? What's the external dialogue that's going on? And being able to play in that particular space, I think also goes a long way to developing teacher artistry and allowing us to actually articulate and embody our own artistry by playing. Yeah.
A couple of people have talked about, I guess, the politics of empathy and citizenship and the red tape and the regulations and the idea of, I guess, advocacy. I think this would be now a good time to talk about advocacy for the arts as a point of...
I'm just trying, sorry, I haven't got my glasses on, so I'm trying to read the... yes. Where's the question about?
So this one from Louise says, how can we overcome the red tape and regulations to build and maintain community as it once was?
What a fantastic question. I'm not sure that in going back we go forward. So I think we build new communities and new communities of practice and praxis. And I think we take from the goodness and the humanity and the social good and the social tapestries that inform us and move forward. And I think they begin really with conversations, and they begin with shared stories. One of the most successful sort of pedagogic tools we have is to listen to each other's stories. And you can do that through the frame of history, you can do that through the frame of poetry, you can do that through sharing of any particular story. One of the stories, and perhaps this is adequately illustrative of how we can build community. My teachers, former students who are now my colleagues, early career teachers I have a particular interest in connection with, who came and worked with me on a history project. We began with sharing stories, and one of the stories shared was from one of the teachers who was born in Lebanon, and she told us and shared through an amanuensis that she was 10 before she was able to walk up tall down a street without hiding behind a post or in a shop front, because of her experiences in Beirut and the sound of what was going on around her. And when she shared that story with others, and when we shared that further and other people had stories and lived experience of sound, we actually developed sort of a community perspective about the importance of sound, the memory of sound, and empathy and sound. So I guess we became a small community in that particular moment. We became a community that was united by sound and the importance and significance of sound, which of course is, you know, a post-cursor rather than a precursor to listening.
Thank you. Man Chung from Shanghai.
Hello, Man.
He has asked the question, do you think empathy is on the decline in Australia? Sarah Conrath from the University of Indiana has noticed a substantial decline, 40% in empathy in the last 40 years in the US. I'm not sure the methodology that...
I'm actually familiar with her work.
Yes.
Whilst I can't speak to, there isn't any current research as far as I'm aware about, generalised empathy in the community in Australia. But certainly there is research regarding the proliferation of digital cultures with young people, and some concerns occasionally about facial, difficulties with reading social and emotional cues because of the proliferation of digital technology and proximity to face. There is a bit around that. And I would want to know a little bit more, Man, about how we'd actually discern that. So, is that a lack of empathy, or is it just a new sort of new cognition? Is that a new articulation? There are lots of different ways different cultures use eye contact, etc. So that sort of physical representation of empathy, I think, can be problematic. But there's certainly research in the medical field that young doctors who enter into the profession, and I don't know how they contextualise that, but are losing that capacity for empathy very quickly, and that's deeply problematic.
Janelle, one of our dear colleagues here who has done a lot of work with refugees, and she has asked the question, how do you see empathy sitting within a neoliberal education system where competition has become so fundamental?
Well, because I'm not allowed to use bad language, Janelle, I don't know where we even start with that at the moment.
But maybe that's one of the things.
I think that's a point, yeah.
For Create to investigate.
I think your point, your very well made point is the way I think empathy and acts of empathy and habits of empathy are inherently activist. And I think they're inherently and importantly and quietly activistic often. And I think the action of being in a classroom and stepping into a painting and asking a better question and thinking about a perspective and being troubled perhaps by an answer or a lack of understanding, I think that's where we challenge those pillars of neoliberal concern. I think, I agree, Man, I can just see, I agree, absolutely, it needs more research. Absolutely.
Well, we're just drawing to a close now. If anyone wants to desperately ask a question, put it in
Teresa. My friend in London.
Oh, wow. I've met Teresa. Yeah. Hi. Oh, yes. Lego. I'm desperate to get to a Lego conference. I just want to say thank you all for attending. I will post this PowerPoint because we do have some information there regarding the upcoming events from Create, and also if you would like to become a member. We're going to look at,
I'll have a look at and be able to respond individually to all of those questions that have come up on the chat. We'll have them as a repository. I look forward to responding.
And I also just want to point out these beautiful images here by Antonia Perricone-Murchak, and she's here with us. And her story about and she's generously shared these points, and I've just lost my slide with some information about Antonia's work, but her word is empathy. So I think that's a great word for you, and it's a great word for us to take into the weekend as well. We really are so appreciative of you all for being here and to make the time. And thank you, Ali, for making this your life's work as well. It's important and it's timely, and we need it to survive. Oh, and you're getting some claps on the screen as well.
Lovely. Oh, and my friend Michael Finneran. Oh.
Yeah. What a community.
What a community. Here we all are.
Yes.
Thank you very much, everybody. And to everybody who's been on. And I can see, I'm dying to go through all the chat, because I can see lots of my former students now colleagues. So I'm really looking forward to seeing you and connecting with you through the chat. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.